Hands where I can see them. Don't move!
I'm not moving. My hands are up.
Who are you? What are you doing here?
Officer, I am unarmed. Lower the weapon.
I give the orders here.
This is unnecessary. Let's talk.
A routine traffic stop on a desolate stretch of highway. A badge used as a shield for arrogance. When a reckless officer pulls his weapon on a calm, unarmed black woman, he thinks he holds all the power. He is dead wrong. What he does not know is that the woman bleeding on the asphalt is a highly decorated U.S. Army colonel, and she is about to unleash a storm of justice that will dismantle his entire life, exposing a web of corruption. Rain slicked the asphalt of Route 119, reflecting the pale, intermittent glow of passing streetlights. Evelyn Hayes kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers providing a hypnotic soundtrack to her exhaustion. It had been less than 48 hours since her boots had touched American soil after a grueling 18-month deployment in the Middle East. At 42, she had dedicated more than half her life to the United States Army, rising through the ranks with a quiet, unyielding competence that had earned her the eagles of a full colonel. Tonight, however, she was not Colonel Hayes. She was just Evelyn, a weary traveler in a faded gray college sweater and civilian jeans, driving a modest 10-year-old sedan back to her newly assigned post at Fort Campbell. She just wanted a hot shower and a bed that did not smell like canvas and desert dust. A sudden burst of red and blue lights shattered the darkness in her rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a police siren cut through the ambient noise of the storm. Evelyn glanced at her speedometer. She was doing exactly 45 in a 45 zone. Her registration was current, her insurance was paid, and her vehicle, though, was meticulously maintained. Deciding not to panic, her military training kept her heart rate completely steady. She engaged her right turn signal, smoothly decelerating, and guided her car onto the brightly lit shoulder of a closed gas station to ensure safety for both herself and the officer. Behind her, the cruiser jerked to a halt, the high beams glaring aggressively into her mirrors. Officer Thomas Decker stepped out into the freezing drizzle. He was a man whose uniform always seemed a size too tight, matching a deeply entrenched ego that required constant validation. Dika had a reputation in Oak Haven County, one built on intimidation and a heavy hand shielded by a police union that had quietly buried 6 excessive force complaints in the last 3 years. Tonight he was agitated, annoyed by the rain, and looking for a target to project his foul mood onto. His partner, a 23-year-old rookie named Brian Miller, stepped out of the passenger side, looking hesitant. Miller had only been on the force for 2 months and had already learned that questioning Decker was a fast track to career suicide. Decker approached the driver's side of Evelyn's sedan, his hand casually resting on the grip of his service weapon. A blatant intimidation tactic. He tapped his heavy flashlight against her window, a sharp, jarring sound. Evelyn lowered the window, keeping both of her hands clearly visible on the top of the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of the fear Decker was accustomed to hearing. "License and registration," Decker snapped, shining the blinding beam of his flashlight directly into her eyes. Evelyn squinted, but did not break her composure. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" she inquired politely. "I don't need to explain myself to you. License and registration." "Now," Decker growled, leaning closer. The smell of stale coffee and stale aggression washed over her. "My wallet is in my leather bag on the passenger seat," Evelyn stated, moving slowly and deliberately. "I'm going to reach over with my right hand to retrieve it." "Is that acceptable?" Dika scoffed, clearly irritated by her calm, methodical communication. "Just get the damn ID." Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, reaching toward the worn leather duffel bag on the passenger seat. The bag contained her civilian identification, her military ID, and heavily classified deployment transfer documents. As her fingers grazed the zipper of the bag, the sudden glare of the cruiser's spotlight shifted, casting a strange shadow across the interior of the car. I said, "Get the ID," Dicko yelled, his voice suddenly spiking in pitch. For a man who sought control, Evelyn's total lack of intimidation was infuriating him. He wanted her nervous. He wanted her to beg. "I'm opening the bag now," Evelyn said, her tone taking on the firm, authoritative edge she usually reserved for panicked young lieutenants in combat zones. "Stop moving," Decca screamed, stepping back and unholstering his weapon in a single jerky motion. Rookie Officer Miller, standing near the rear bumper, flinched. "Tom, what's going on?" Miller called out, his voice cracking. "Show me your hands. Show me your hands," Decca shouted, pointing the barrel of his Glock directly at Evelyn's head. Evelyn froze immediately. She knew exactly how volatile a poorly trained man with a gun could be. She slowly raised both of her empty hands, palms facing the officer, moving away from the bag. "My hands are visible. I am unarmed. I am not a threat." "You were reaching for something." Decca's chest heaved. The situation had escalated entirely inside his own head, fueled by his unchecked biases and fragile authority. "I was reaching for the identification you requested," Evelyn replied, her voice remaining impossibly steady, though a cold anger was beginning to pull in her chest. "My hands are in the air. I'm going to step out of the vehicle if you want to search the bag yourself. Don't you move a muscle." Decca's finger was inside the trigger guard. He was trembling. The rain continued to fall, slicking his grip. Evelyn looked him dead in the eyes. She had faced down insurgent ambushes and mortar fire, and now she was staring down the barrel of a terrified, incompetent local cop in her own country. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the rain with pure, unadulterated command. "Lower your weapon. You are escalating a non-lethal traffic stop. Lower it now." That authoritative command, the tone of a superior officer giving a direct order, snapped Decca's fragile ego. He did not process the logic. He only processed the defiance. A deafening crack echoed through the wet night air. The glass of the driver's side window shattered outward in a brilliant explosion of safety glass. Evelyn felt an agonizing white-hot tearing sensation rip through her upper left shoulder. The sheer kinetic force of the 9mm hollow point round threw her violently against the center console. The world tilted. The sound of the rain faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Blood, warm and thick, immediately began to soak the gray wool of her sweater. Shots fired. Shots fired. Decca was screaming into his shoulder radio, his voice bordering on hysterical. Suspect reached for a weapon. I had to fire. Evelyn slumped against the passenger seat, gripping her torn shoulder. Her military training instantly bypassed the pain, shifting her brain into trauma management mode. Assess the wound. Stop the bleeding. Stay conscious. She was bleeding heavily, but her breathing was steady. The bullet had missed her heart and her lungs. She was alive, and as the shock began to recede, it was replaced by an absolute terrifying resolve. This man had no idea who he had just tried to kill. "Tom, what did you do?" Officer Miller sprinted forward, his face pale with horror. He looked into the shattered window and saw the woman bleeding heavily over the center console. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding her own shoulder, her jaw clenched tight. She had a weapon. She was reaching. Decca shouted, pacing aggressively back and forth in the rain, already rehearsing the lie that had saved his career before. "You saw it, Brian. She was reaching under the seat. She said she was getting her ID," Miller cried out, pulling his own medical kit from his belt, clear his throat. He yanked the driver's side door open. Mom, stay with me." Evelyn looked up at the terrified rookie. Despite the agonizing pain radiating down her left arm, her mind remained terrifyingly sharp. "Arterial bleeding," she managed to say, her voice strained but incredibly calm. "Apply pressure high and tight." Miller was shaking violently as he pulled a wad of gauze and pressed it against the entry wound on her shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "An ambulance is coming," the young officer stammered, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "You don't apologize," Decca barked, grabbing Miller by the shoulder and hauling him back. "She's a suspect. Secure her hands. She's bleeding to death, Tom. She doesn't have a gun." Miller shoved his senior officer away. A desperate flash of courage overtaking his fear, he turned back to Evelyn, pressing hard on the wound. Evelyn locked eyes with Miller. "Look in the bag," she whispered, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. Green folder. Before Miller could reach for the bag, the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 more cruisers screeched into the gas station parking lot, followed closely by an ambulance. Chaos erupted. Paramedics shoved the police officers aside, dragging Evelyn onto a gurney. They worked frantically, calling out blood pressure readings and heart rates, their hands slick with her blood. Decca stood by his cruiser, turning off his body camera with a subtle click. He pulled Captain Richard Caldwell aside as soon as the commanding officer arrived on the scene. Caldwell was a grizzled 20-year veteran who cared more about the department's public image and pension fund than actual justice. "What happened, Decca?" Caldwell asked in a low, growly voice. "Routine stop. Busted tail light." Decca lied smoothly. She got combative, refused orders, reached into a duffel bag and pulled a dark object. "I feared for my life, Captain. I had to neutralize the threat." Caldwell looked over at the shattered glass and the pool of blood on the pavement. "Did you secure the weapon?" "Miller's tossing the car now," Decca Geyer said confidently. He knew there was no weapon, but he also knew how to plan a narrative, probably tossed it under the seat. "Look, she's a nobody. Shabby clothes, old car, just some aggressive drifter." Caldwell nodded slowly. "All right, get your union rep on the phone. We'll lock down the scene. Nobody talks to the press." Meanwhile, the ambulance hurtled toward Oak Haven Memorial Hospital. In the back, the paramedics was struggling to stabilize Evelyn's blood pressure. "We need to cut the sweater to get to the exit wound," one of the medics shouted over the rumble of the engine. He took a pair of heavy trauma shears and sliced through the thick gray wool of her collar, pulling the fabric aside. The medic froze, resting heavily against Evelyn's collarbone. Stained with her own blood was a set of dull, silver military dog tags. The medic read the stamped metal. "Hayes Evelyn M.06/Colonel, U.S. Army." "Oh my God," the medic breathed, his eyes widening. He looked down at the woman whose life he was trying to save. "She's a colonel." Evelyn's eyes fluttered open for a brief second. "Secure my bag," she rasped. "Classified documents." Then she slipped into unconsciousness. By the time Evelyn was wheeled into emergency surgery, Captain Caldwell had already set the department's spin machine into motion. A press release was drafted. An Oak Haven police officer was forced to discharge his weapon during a tense traffic stop involving an uncooperative and hostile suspect. They placed a police guard at the door of Evelyn's recovery room, effectively classifying her as a prisoner under arrest for assaulting an officer. Back at the precinct, Decca was sitting in the break room, drinking bad coffee and laughing with another officer. "I'm telling you, man, these people think they can just ignore commands, play stupid games, win stupid prizes." At that exact moment, 200 meters away at the Regional Military Command Center, a red light began flashing on a secure terminal. Colonel Evelyn Hayes had failed to check in upon her arrival in the sector. Standard protocol dictated a trace on her encrypted mobile device. The GPS coordinates pinged directly inside the surgical ward of Oak Haven Memorial Hospital. Major David Lawson, Evelyn's fiercely loyal executive officer, stared at the screen. He knew Hayes better than anyone. She was a tactical genius who survived 2 IED explosions and a direct siege on a forward operating base. She didn't just end up in civilian hospitals. Lawson made 3 phone calls. The final call was to General Arthur Campbell at the Pentagon. 4 hours later, the sun was just beginning to rise over the dreary town of Oak Haven. Captain Caldwell was asleep at his desk when the sound of heavy diesel engines rattled his office windows. He groaned, rubbing his eyes, and walked over to the blinds. His blood ran entirely cold. Pulling into the small municipal parking lot of the Oak Haven Police Department were 3 heavily armored black military SUVs flanked by 2 Army CID Criminal Investigation Division tactical transports. Heavily armed, unsmiling military police officers in full tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, immediately securing the perimeter of the civilian police station. Major Lawson stepped out of the lead SUV, his uniform pristine, his face carved from granite. He bypassed the stunned desk sergeant and marched directly toward Caldwell's office, kicking the door open before Caldwell could even reach for the handle. "Captain Caldwell," Lawson demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. "Who the hell are you? You can't just barge in here." Caldwell sputtered instinctively, dropping his hand toward his belt. Two CD officers immediately stepped into the room, their hands resting on their sidearms, their eyes daring Caldwell to make a move. Lawson stepped forward, tossing a heavily redacted federal warrant onto Caldwell's desk. "I am Major David Lawson, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. 4 hours ago, one of your men discharged a firearm into the chest of my commanding officer, Colonel Evelyn Hayes. You have exactly 30 seconds to hand over all body cam footage, dash cam footage, and the officer responsible, or I will dismantle this entire precinct, brick by brick." Caldwell stared at the warrant, his stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss. The nobody drifter. The uncooperative suspect. They had just shot a highly decorated colonel of the United States Army, and the wrath of the federal government had just arrived on their doorstep. Captain Richard Caldwell had spent 2 decades building a FFTM in Oak Haven. He knew every judge, golfed with the district attorney, and had an ironclad mutual protection pact with the local police union. But looking into the cold, dead eyes of Major David Lawson, Caldwell realized that his local power meant absolutely nothing. The federal government had just breached his walls, and they were not asking for permission to enter. "Major, you need to step down," Caldwell stammered, trying to inject some authority back into his trembling voice. He stood up, puffing out his chest, a futile gesture against the heavily armed CID agents flanking the doorway. "This is a local jurisdiction. You have no right to storm my precinct. Whatever happened out there is being investigated by our Internal Affairs Division. You cannot bypass due process." Lawson did not blink. He stepped closer, invading Caldwell's personal space. The height difference was only a few inches, but Lawson's sheer presence made him seem like a towering monolith. "Your officer shot a United States Army colonel who was transporting classified Level 4 Department of Defense materials," Lawson said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "That immediately triggers federal jurisdiction under the National Security Act. Your jurisdiction evaporated." The second Thomas Decker pulled his trigger. "Now, where is the evidence room? You need a subpoena for our servers," Caldwell shouted, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Martin Grigsby, our union president, is already on his way. You touch my officers, and we will sue the military into the Stone Age." Lawson gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the CID agent on his right, Special Agent Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins, a former ranger who moved with lethal grace, unclipped a heavy steel breaching tool from her tactical vest. She walked straight past Caldwell, out of the office, and down the hall toward the server room. "Hey, you cannot go in there," Caldwell yelled, lunging forward. Lawson's hand shot out, grabbing Caldwell by the front of his uniform shirt and slamming him back down into his leather desk chair with bone-rattling force. "Sit down, Captain," Lawson commanded. "If you obstruct a federal military investigation involving classified intelligence, I will have you in federal lockup before your morning coffee gets cold. Now, give me the name of the shooter." "Officer Thomas Decker," a quiet, shaking voice said from the doorway. Lawson turned. Standing in the hall was rookie Brian Miller. His uniform was heavily stained with Evelyn's blood. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Miller, shut your mouth," Caldwell roared from his chair. Miller shook his head, looking directly at Lawson. "Decca shot her. I was there. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She told us she was reaching for her ID. He panicked, and she told me to secure her green folder. I have it." Miller reached into his jacket and pulled out a blood-spattered, thick green military dossier, holding it out to Lawson. Lawson's expression softened for a fraction of a second as he took the folder, verifying the unbroken federal seal. He looked at the rookie's blood-soaked hands. "You applied the pressure to the arterial wound?" "Yes, sir," Miller whispered. "You saved her life, son," Lawson said firmly. He then turned to his radio. "Jenkins, secure the servers. Team 2, locate Officer Thomas Decker. Apprehend and detain." Down the hall in the precinct's break room, Thomas Decker was aggressively biting into a stale donut, laughing as he regaled a pair of dispatchers with his fabricated tale of heroism. "I'm telling you," she had this crazy look in her eye. "You hesitate out there, you die. I did what I had to do." Standard textbook neutralization. The break room door did not just open, it was kicked off its hinges. 4 CID tactical officers swarmed the room. Before Decca could even drop his donut, let alone reach for his weapon, 2 heavily armored men grabbed him by his shoulders, slammed him face first onto the linoleum floor, and wrenched his arms behind his back. The sickening click of heavy-duty steel handcuffs echoed in the small room. "What the hell is this? Get off me!" Decca screamed, struggling violently against the immense weight of the military police officers pinning him down. "I'm a cop. You can't do this. Caldwell. Get Caldwell." Major Lawson walked into the break room, his boots crunching on the shattered wood of the door frame. He looked down at Decca with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Officer Thomas Decker," Lawson said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You are being detained by the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division for the attempted murder of a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. You are also being held on suspicion of treasonous interference with classified federal intelligence." Decca stopped struggling. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost. "Commissioned officer? What are you talking about? She was a nobody. She was just some drifter." "The woman you shot is Colonel Evelyn Hayes," Lawson replied coldly. "She spent the last 18 months hunting terrorists in the Syrian desert, and she has more honor in her severed fingernail than you have in your entire miserable existence." No. There's a mistake." Decca began to hyperventilate, the horrific reality of his situation finally piercing his armor of arrogance. She reached. She had a gun. Miller saw it. "Check my body camera." It malfunctioned, but I swear she reached. "We already checked the servers," Agent Jenkins said, stepping into the room with a hard drive secured in an anti-static bag. "Your body camera was manually switched off 3 seconds after you fired the shot. But you forgot one thing, Decca. Your rookie partner forgot to turn his off. We have the whole thing in high definition." Decca let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face against the dirty linoleum. The indestructible shield of his badge had just been shattered into a million unreoverable pieces. "Get him out of my sight," Lawson ordered. "Transport him to the federal holding facility at Fort Campbell. Do not let him speak to anyone." As Decca was dragged out of the precinct, kicking and crying for a union representative who could no longer save him, Lawson turned his attention back to the rookie. "Miller, you are coming with us. You are the sole material witness, and this precinct is no longer safe for you." The federal takeover of Oak Haven Police Department was complete in less than 30 minutes. They stripped the evidence room, seized the digital servers, and humiliated the corrupt leadership in front of their entire staff. Karma had not just knocked on Thomas Decker's door. It had kicked it down with a steel-toed boot. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing Evelyn registered. The sound was familiar, grounding her in a reality she had woken up to more than once during her military career. The smell, however, was different. It lacked the pungent scent of canvas and iodine, typical of a field hospital. This room smelled of crisp, sterile linen and highly potent antiseptic. She slowly opened her eyes. Immediately assaulted by the harsh, fluorescent lights overhead, she blinked rapidly, her vision swimming before focusing on the acoustic tiles of the ceiling. A deep, throbbing agony radiated from her left shoulder, wrapping around her chest like a band of hot iron. "Welcome back, Colonel," a familiar baritone voice said softly from the corner of the room. Evelyn Clear's throat, turned her head slightly, wincing at the pull on her neck muscles. Major Lawson was sitting in a rigid plastic visitor's chair, his posture perfectly straight, a tablet resting on his knee. He looked tired, the dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night, but his expression was one of profound relief. "David," Evelyn rasped, her throat incredibly dry. She tried to swallow. "Status." Lawson immediately stood, pouring a small cup of water from a plastic pitcher and holding a straw to her lips. "You are at the secure medical wing of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. We medevoxed you out of Oak Haven Memorial. The moment the surgical team stabilized your vitals, you took a 9mm round to the upper left clavicle. It shattered the bone and tore through the deltoid muscle. The surgical team had to use a titanium plate to rebuild the collarbone." Evelyn took a slow sip of water, letting the cool liquid soothe her raw throat. She closed her eyes, piecing together the fragmented memories of the dark rain-slicked highway, the blinding flashlight, the screaming officer, the deafening crack of the gunshot. "The rookie," Evelyn said, her eyes snapping open. "The young kid. He tried to stop the bleeding." "Where is he?" "Officer Brian Miller is currently under federal protection at Fort Campbell," Lawson explained, setting the water cup down. "He's been fully debriefed and has provided a sworn, Clear's throat, recorded statement detailing the entire incident. He surrendered the classified dossier you instructed him to secure." "Everything is intact, Colonel." Evelyn let out a slow, painful breath, relief washing over her. "And the shooter?" Lawson's jaw tightened, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. "Officer Thomas Decker, he is currently sitting in a windowless federal interrogation cell. He tried to spin the narrative, claimed you reached for a weapon. His captain, Richard Caldwell, attempted to orchestrate a cover-up before your blood was even dry on the asphalt." "Of course he did," Evelyn murmured bitterly. She had spent her life fighting enemies overseas who hid in caves and behind masks. It disgusted her to her core to find enemies in her own country, hiding behind badges and the public trust. Did Decca's body camera catch the shooting? "Decca manually disabled his camera immediately after firing," Lawson said, pulling up a video file on his tablet. "But he made a fatal tactical error. He failed to ensure his rookie partner did the same." Clear's throat. Miller's camera captured the entire exchange from the rear angle. The audio is crystal clear. Lawson turned the tablet so Evelyn could see the screen. She watched in grim silence as the digital replay of her own near-death experience played out. She heard her own voice, remarkably calm, explaining her movements. She watched Decca's unhinged escalation, and she watched the moment he pulled the trigger on an unarmed, compliant woman whose hands were visibly in the air. "It's damning," Lawson stated flatly. "Agent Jenkins has already handed the footage over to the Department of Justice. But it gets worse, Evelyn." Evelyn looked away from the screen, focusing on Lawson. "How much worse?" "Jenkins ran a deep dive background check on Thomas Decca in the Oak Haven precinct," Lawson explained, his voice thick with disgust. "Decca has 6 prior complaints for excessive force against unarmed minority civilians in the last 3 years alone. 2 of them resulted in severe hospitalizations. Every single one of those complaints was buried by Captain Caldwell and the local police union president Martin Grigsby. They intimidated witnesses, falsified police reports, and protected a violently unstable man because it was politically convenient for the department's arrest statistics." A cold, hard fury began to settle in Evelyn's chest, temporarily overriding the agonizing pain in her shoulder. This was not just about one bad cop having a panic attack in the rain. This, Clear's throat, was a systematic, calculated machine of corruption that preyed on the vulnerable. Decca had shot her because he felt absolutely untouchable. He believed the system he worked for would catch him, protect him, and validate his violence, just as it had done 6 times before. He just never expected his seventh victim to have the entire United States military apparatus standing behind her. They thought I was a nobody, Evelyn said quietly, staring at the white wall opposite her bed. They looked at my old car, my faded clothes, and the color of my skin, and they calculated that I was disposable. They thought there would be no consequences. They miscalculated, Lawson said firmly. No, David, they calculated perfectly based on the environment they built, Evelyn corrected him, her voice gaining strength infused with the ironclad resolve of a commanding officer. If I had actually been a civilian, a mother coming home from a night shift or a college student traveling through their town, I would be dead right now. And Decca would be accepting a medal for bravery, backed by a falsified report. She slowly pushed herself up against the pillows, ignoring the sharp spike of pain from her collarbone. She looked directly at Lawson, the fire in her eyes burning away the haze of the painkillers. I am not just pressing charges against Thomas Decker for attempted murder, Evelyn declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. I want the Department of Justice to tear that entire precinct down to the foundation. I want Captain Caldwell indicted for conspiracy and evidence tampering. I want Martin Grigsby investigated for union racketeering and witness intimidation. We are going to expose every single buried file, every hidden complaint, and every shattered life they swept under their filthy rug. Lawson smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. I already have a team of federal prosecutors drafting the RICO Act indictments, Colonel. We are bringing a war to Oak Haven. Evelyn nodded slowly. Good. Tell Agent Jenkins I want to speak to the DOJ task force. Lead by tomorrow morning. And David? Yes, Colonel. Make sure Officer Miller gets the best legal protection the federal government can buy. Evelyn said softly. He stood up to a monster when he had everything to lose. That kid is the only real cop in that entire town. The morning sun did little to warm the cold dread settling over the town of Oak Haven. Inside the dimly lit, smoke-filled office of the local police union, Martin Grigsby paced like a caged animal. Grigsby had been the union president for 12 years, a man who had built an empire by ensuring that no officer under his umbrella ever faced true accountability. He had buried internal affairs reports, intimidated local journalists, and bullied city council members into submission. But as he stared at the television screen mounted on his wall, he realized that his playbook was entirely useless against the federal government. The breaking news graphic flashed across the bottom of the screen in bright, urgent red. U.S. Army colonel shot unarmed by local police during routine traffic stop. Federal takeover of Oak Haven precinct. Turn that garbage off, Captain Richard Caldwell shouted, slamming his fist down on Grigsby's mahogany desk. Caldwell looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single night. His uniform was rumpled, his face unshaven and his eyes wild with panic. Martin, you told me you had the DA on standby. You told me we could contain this. I cannot contain the Department of Justice, Richard. Grigsby fired back, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. My contacts in the district attorney's office won't even return my calls. The FBI froze our union bank accounts an hour ago. We cannot even hire outside defense counsel. They are treating us like a cartel because you operated like one. A smooth, authoritative voice echoed from the doorway. Both men froze. Standing in the entrance of the union office was a man in a sharply tailored Navy suit flanked by 4 FBI agents wearing tactical windbreakers. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a stack of federal warrants in the other. Samuel Harrington, United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The man introduced himself, stepping into the room with terrifying calm. Martin Grigsby, Richard Caldwell, you are both under arrest. Caldwell backed up against the wall, his chest heaving. Arrest for what? I wasn't even at the scene. You are being charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, otherwise known as RICO, Harrington stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. We have spent the last 12 hours analyzing the servers Major Lawson's team seized from your precinct. We found the deleted files, Captain. The six buried excessive force complaints against Officer Decker, the altered dispatch logs, the emails between you and Mr. Grigsby coordinating the intimidation of civilian witnesses. You did not just cover up the attempted murder of Colonel Evelyn Hayes, you ran a systemic, organized criminal enterprise out of a taxpayer-fumed police station. Grigsby tried to summon his old bluster, pointing a trembling finger at the federal prosecutor. You are overstepping, Harrington. This is a union office. You have no jurisdiction to raid this building without a federal judge signing off. Harrington casually handed the top paper from his stack to an FBI agent who pinned it directly to Grigsby's chest. Signed by a federal judge at 3 o'clock in the morning, handcuffed them. The agents moved with brutal efficiency. Grigsby, a man who had spent a decade terrifying the citizens of Oak Haven, whimpered as his wrists were wrenched behind his back and bound in heavy steel. Caldwell did not even fight. He simply slumped his shoulders, the realization of his complete and utter ruin breaking his spirit instantly as they were marched out of the Union building. The karma of their actions finally caught up to them in the most public way possible. Harrington had purposefully tipped off the national media. A sea of news vans, reporters, and blinding camera flashes surrounded the entrance. The local citizens of Oak Haven, many of whom had been victimized by Caldwell's corrupt precinct, stood on the sidewalks, watching in stunned silence as the two most powerful men in the county were shoved into the back of armored federal transport vehicles. 200 meters away in her sterile room at Walter Reed, Evelyn watched the broadcast on a small, flat-screen television. Major Lawson stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare look of satisfaction on his usually stoic face. "They look smaller on television," Evelyn remarked softly, adjusting the sling that held her left arm immobile. The pain medication was making her groggy, but the sheer vindication of seeing the systemic rot pulled out by its roots kept her mind sharp. "Bullies always do when you take away their badges," Lawson replied, turning away from the window. "Harrington's team is tearing the precinct down to the studs. Every officer who participated in the cover-up is being suspended pending federal review. The governor has dispatched the state police to take over patrols in Oak Haven until the department can be entirely rebuilt from the ground up." "And the previous victims?" Evelyn asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "The people Decca hurt before me?" "Harrington is reopening every single case," Lawson assured her. "Because of your actions, 6 innocent people who were beaten and silenced by Decca are finally going to have their day in court. They are safe now." Evelyn leaned back against her pillows, letting out a long, slow breath. She had taken a bullet, endured agonizing surgery, and faced down the barrel of a terrified man's gun, Clear's throat. But as she watched Caldwell and Grigsby being driven away to a federal penitentiary, she knew without a shadow of a doubt that the pain was worth the justice it had purchased. The federal holding facility at Fort Campbell was practically designed to break a man's spirit. The walls of Interrogation Room 4 were made of reinforced concrete, painted a dull, soul-crushing gray. The fluorescent light above flickered with an irritating hum. There were no windows, no clocks, and absolutely no sense of the outside world. Thomas Decker sat in a steel chair bolted to the floor, wearing a bright orange federal jumpsuit. He had been in custody for 36 hours. The bravado, the arrogance, and the violent entitlement that had defined his career were entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, shaking terror. He looked at his hands, realizing that the silver handcuffs biting into his wrists were not going to be removed anytime soon. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Major Lawson walked in, followed closely by Samuel Harrington. They did not sit down. They stood on the opposite side of the steel table, looking down at Decca as if he were a particularly repulsive insect. "Officer Decca," Harrington began, opening a thick manila folder and tossing a stack of high-resolution photographs onto the table. "My name is Samuel Harrington. I am the federal prosecutor who will be dismantling the rest of your life." Decca swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the two men. "I want my union rep. I want Grigsby," You can't question me without my representative. Martin Grigsby is currently sitting in a cell 3 blocks away, crying into a paper cup, Harrington said smoothly. He was indicted on federal racketeering charges this morning alongside your former captain, Richard Caldwell. There is no union left to protect you, Decca. You are entirely alone. The last remnants of Decca's hope evaporated in an instant. He stared at the photographs on the table. They were crime scene photos from the highway, Evelyn's shattered window, the pool of blood on the center console, the bloody green military dossier. I thought she was reaching for a gun, Decca stammered, falling back on the only lie he knew, his voice cracking pitifully. It was dark. She wasn't complying. I feared for my life. Lorson leaned forward, placing both of his large hands on the steel table. You feared for your life because a calm, unarmed woman told you she was reaching for her identification. You feared for your life because she did not cower in your presence. Or did you pull that trigger because you are a weak, pathetic man who uses a badge to compensate for his own terrifying insecurities? You don't know what it's like out there, Decca shouted, a desperate, hysterical edge creeping into his voice. You have to make split-second decisions. It was a mistake. It was just a mistake. A mistake is writing the wrong date on a citation, Harrington countered sharply. Firing a hollow point round into the chest of a highly decorated United States military officer because she bruised your ego is not a mistake. It is attempted murder. Harrington pulled a small digital audio recorder from his pocket and set it on the table. But here's the truly fascinating part, Thomas. We told your captain and your union president that they were facing 20 years in federal prison for covering up your crimes. Do you know what they did? Harrington pressed play. The frantic, terrified voice of Captain Caldwell filled the small concrete room. It was all Decca. The guy's a liability. I told Grigsby we should have fired him 2 years ago when he broke that teenager's jaw, but the union forced me to keep him. Decca is unstable. If you give me immunity, I will testify that Decca premeditated the violence. He's completely unhinged. Harrington pressed stop. Decca stared at the recorder, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. The men he had trusted to protect him, the men who had built the corrupt system he thrived in, had thrown him to the wolves the absolute second their own freedom was threatened. The brotherhood he thought he belonged to was a complete illusion held together only by mutual criminality. They sold you out, Decca Lawson said quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, definitive weight of a judge passing a sentence. Every single person who enabled your violence has abandoned you. You are facing charges for attempted murder, aggravated assault under the color of law, and civil rights violations. The Department of Justice is recommending a sentence of 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You will be almost 80 years old before you even see a parole board. Decca broke. He buried his face in his manacled hands, his shoulders shaking as deep, pathetic sobs echoed off the concrete walls. He begged for a deal. He promised to testify against anyone they wanted. He cried for his mother, for his career, for the life he had just carelessly thrown away into the dark. The United States government does not negotiate with domestic terrorists who shoot unarmed citizens, Harrington said coldly, gathering his files. Enjoy the concrete, Thomas. As they walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the broken shell of a man weeping in the silence, Lorson felt his phone vibrate. It was a secure message from Walter Reed. Evelyn was awake, and she was asking for an update. Lorson typed back a single sentence. The fortress has fallen. Meanwhile, in a quiet, heavily guarded hotel room in Washington, D.C., Brian Miller sat at a desk, looking over a set of application papers. Major Lorson had visited him the night before. Miller had assumed his career in law enforcement was over, that his association with Oakhaven would taint him forever. Instead, Lorson had handed him a recruitment packet for the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. You didn't freeze when the monster bared its teeth, Lorson had told the young rookie. You applied pressure to the wound and you secured the intelligence. The Army needs men who know the difference between legal authority and moral right. When this trial is over, we have a place for you. Miller picked up a pen, clears throat, signing his name at the bottom of the federal application. From the ashes of a deeply broken system, a new path had emerged. The karma that had destroyed Thomas Decca had simultaneously rewarded the one man who had chosen to do the right thing in the darkest of moments. The universe had balanced its scales. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the Capitol as Evelyn Hayes walked up the wide granite steps of the United States District Court. She no longer wore the faded civilian clothes from that terrible night. Today she wore the impeccable, sharply pressed Army service uniform. The silver eagles on her shoulders gleamed in the sunlight, her chest heavy with ribbons detailing a lifetime of service, including her new Purple Heart. Her left arm moved a little stiffer than before. The titanium plate in her collarbone, a permanent reminder of the violence, but her posture was absolute, unbroken, and fiercely proud. Major David Lawson walked in perfect step beside her, his uniform flawless. Behind them walked Special Agent Sarah Jenkins and Federal Prosecutor Samuel Harrington. They moved together as a single unit, parting the sea of reporters and flashing cameras gathered to witness the final chapter of the Oak Haven saga. Inside the massive courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Thomas Decker sat at the defense table, drowning in an oversized orange federal jumpsuit that made him look small and insignificant. His complexion was a sickly pale gray from 6 months in solitary confinement. Beside him sat Richard Caldwell and Martin Grigsby, stripped of their glory, looking like hollow, defeated shells. All rise. The bailiff's voice boomed, echoing loudly off the high ceilings. Judge Thomas Kavanaugh took his seat, his stern gaze sweeping over the defendants before settling respectfully on Colonel Hayes. The trial had been swift and devastating for the defense. Armed with Miller's body camera footage, Caldwell's cowardly testimony against Decca, and a mountain of decrypted emails proving systemic racketeering, the defense never stood a chance. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts. Today was sentencing, and Evelyn had specifically requested to speak. Colonel Hayes, Judge Kavanaugh said, his voice softening just a fraction. The court recognizes your right to deliver a victim impact statement. You have the floor. Evelyn stood up. The courtroom fell deathly silent. She did not walk to the podium. Instead, she stood firmly at her table, squaring her shoulders and locking her eyes onto Thomas Decca. Decca tried to look down, but the overwhelming weight of Evelyn's commanding presence compelled him to look up. For 18 months, I commanded troops in a hostile theater of war, Evelyn began, her voice steady and unshakable. I led soldiers through insurgent ambushes and mortar fire. I watched them bleed to protect the ideals of this country. Yet the closest I ever came to losing my life was on a quiet highway in my own nation, at the hands of a man sworn to protect me. Decca flinched. You did not pull that trigger because you were in danger, Thomas. Evelyn continued, her words slicing through the silence. You pulled it because you saw a black woman alone on a dark road and your fragile ego could not tolerate my refusal to cower. You relied on a corrupt system built by the two cowards sitting next to you to shield you from your own inadequacy. But that shield is broken. I did not just survive your bullet. I survived to ensure you can never hide behind a badge again. She turned her uncompromising gaze to Caldwell and Grigsby. Your corruption thrived in the dark, relying on the silence of the vulnerable. You thought you were untouchable kings, but you forgot there are still people who uphold the oaths they swear. Evelyn turned back to face the judge. Your Honor, I ask that these men be sentenced, not just for what they did to me, but for the countless innocent citizens they terrorized and silenced before I arrived. They broke the public trust. Let their punishment serve as the ultimate reminder that absolutely no badge is heavier than the law. Evelyn sat down. The silence was absolute. Judge Kavanaugh adjusted his glasses, looking at the defendants with undisguised disgust. Thomas Decker, for the egregious crimes of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and civil rights violations under the color of law, I sentence you to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Decca let out a choked sob, burying his face in his manacled hands as his life officially ended. Richard Caldwell, Martin Grigsby. The judge continued, for racketeering, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and the systemic deprivation of civil rights, I sentence you both to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The gavel fell with a definitive crack echoing like a gunshot, but this time it was the sound of justice. U.S. Marshals moved in, hauling the broken men out of the courtroom. Their era of terror was permanently over. Outside, the autumn sun shone brightly. Evelyn took a deep breath of the crisp air, feeling a hard-earned sense of closure wash over her. Oak Haven was already healing. The DOJ had dissolved the old precinct, establishing a federally monitored police force. The 6 previous victims of Decca's violence had been awarded civil settlements. Their records cleared, their voices finally heard. Major Lawson stepped up beside her, offering a rare, genuine smile. "It is finished, Colonel. The transport is waiting to take us back to base. Your promotion ceremony to Brigadier General is in 2 weeks, and the Pentagon wants you rested." "I'm ready, David." Evelyn smiled back, the weight of the last 6 months finally lifting from her shoulders. As they walked down the steps, a young man in a crisp military uniform jogged up, stopping to snap a perfect salute. It was Brian Miller. He looked healthier, sharper, filled with a profound sense of purpose. After graduating from the Army CD program at the top of his class, Evelyn returned the salute. "Agent Miller, it suits you." "Thank you, Mom," Miller said, his voice steady. "I wanted to thank you for everything." "You saved my life, Brian," Evelyn replied softly. "And you chose the truth when a lie was easier. That is what makes a real soldier. Make us proud." "I will, General," he promised firmly. Evelyn turned and walked toward the waiting black vehicle, her head held high. A routine traffic stop had tried to break her, but it had only proven what she already knew. True power does not come from a gun or a badge. It comes from an unbreakable spirit. A commitment to truth and the unwavering courage to stand in the storm until the darkness breaks. And as the car drove away, leaving the courthouse behind, the scales of karma rested perfectly, beautifully balanced once again. What an incredible journey of ultimate justice and resilience. Colonel Evelyn Hayes proved that true strength does not hide behind a corrupt badge. It stands firmly in the blazing light of truth. Her unyielding courage tore down an entire empire of corruption, proving that hard karma always collects its debts in the end. If this real-life story of justice, bravery, and the fight against a broken system inspired you, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic stories where right conquers.